After experimenting with the completion models in Azure AI Studio, it's time to try out the chat models in the same section or portal. So here we are on the Azure AI Studio page, as you can see on the screen. To experiment with the chat models, the first step is to create a deployment just as we did with the completion model. We select this option, which shows us the deployment we did in the previous video. Let's click on the option to create a new deployment. And choose one of the models that allows us to experiment with the chat functionality. In this specific case, I will choose the GPT 3.5 Turbo option, but you could conduct these experiments with other 3.5 versions or even try out version 4 if you have access to it. Then select this option, indicating that I want to update to the latest version by default. Here we have the option to select some available models. Let's give it a name, for example, GPT 3.5 Turbo. Again, we have a section that would allow us to add additional features to this deployment. In my case, I'm going to leave the default values. I will indicate that I want to create this new deployment. Creating the deployment is quite fast. And now it's ready here. Once we have this model set up, we can go to the section that says Chat, which will show us this assistant that is slightly different from the completion assistant. Here we have many additional options to play with. First, on the left side, I'm going to select the default option. We have this section that lets us select different options to experiment with these chat functionalities. First, there's a section that says Use Templates. What does this mean? Well, a template is a set of options you can pre-configure so that the chat behaves in a certain way, so that the model responds in a particular manner or with certain characteristics according to what you specify. What are these features? Well, first, we have an option that says System Message. This option is meant to provide some instructions to the model on how it should behave during a certain conversation. For example, the type of response it should give or the format of the responses. You can also dictate how it should and should not respond. It is important to mention that although there is no limit on the number of tokens we can use in this feature or property, these tokens that form part of the system message are included as part of an API call. Therefore, you should aim to be somewhat concise with the instructions you give to the chat so that the number of tokens used is as few as possible. Next, we have a section called Examples, where we have the option to add different examples. Notice that once I click the button, two options appeared. One to indicate the type of questions or communication the user might direct toward the chat and how the chat should respond to the user. What this allows is for the bot to try and mimic the responses added as part of these examples, so it responds in the way you want. Let's do an example of this. For instance, suppose we have this question in the chat. Hello, my PlayStation is getting very hot. Why could this be? With default behavior, as we've seen here, we're going to indicate that we want to start the conversation by clicking this button that says Send Message. In the event that you see this message, it is indicating why the playground is not working and points out that the GPT 3.5 Turbo Instruct model has been selected. This is because on the right-hand side, you can see a section called Deployment, and by default, the model or deployment we created in the previous video has been selected. So we must select the model we're interested in, which is the one directly linked to the chat model. Once selected, I will click again, erase the entire chat, and paste this query. I'll click Send, and you can see that the chat is now responding with the appropriate answer for the question I posed here. We have the description of the answer, which gives some ideas as to why the PlayStation might be overheating at times. So we see that with the default behavior, the chat responds very generally. However, suppose we have a store that sells only Xbox consoles. If we let users input those types of questions, obviously this wouldn't be optimal. This implies that tokens are spent on questions that may not be relevant for your business. What could we do in this case? Well, we could configure the couple of options we saw earlier, system messages and examples, to suit your business. How is this possible? Well, we select one of the preset templates or one we can choose by default. Let's confirm we want to use these options, and this will automatically fill in the system message and examples for us, giving us a starting point if we need or want it. Now, I'll show the entire system message. Notice how concise the instructions are on how the chatbot should behave. The system message says, "You are an Xbox customer support agent whose primary goal is to help users with issues they may have with their Xbox devices." We are defining how the agent should behave, but it also gives additional instructions, such as being friendly and concise to prevent overly verbose responses. It states that this bot should only provide subjective solutions to the queries made and should not offer answers unrelated to Xbox, which greatly limits the content we want the bot to respond to. As an example, we can see a simulated user question asking, "How much does a PlayStation 5 cost?" The assistant should respond that it does not have access to that kind of information because its primary focus is on Xbox devices only. Here, the bot asks if there is another question it can help the user with. Thus, we are giving directions on how the bot or chatbot should respond to the questions asked. With this configuration applied, let's copy the question, clear the entire chat, and try to make the inquiry again. Let's see how the bot responds. Okay, this time the chat indicates an apology and explains that as an Xbox customer support agent, it has no information about PlayStation cancels. As an additional note, the chat provides reasons for this response. Perhaps we could be more consistent with the questions or the instructions we give to the chat, so it omits that kind of text and simply states it cannot provide information about PlayStation consoles. But this is a good starting point for us to understand how the chat system works using the GPT 3.5 and GPT-4 models. Also, on the right-hand side, we have the configuration settings. We have previously seen this option called deployment. There is also a setting allowing us to configure how many messages from the chat history we want to send to the API to get specific information based on that data. Consider that, once again, the number of tokens you will use for an API request will depend on the amount of data sent. The more messages sent, obviously, the higher the token cost will be since it will consider more tokens from the conversation. In the Parameters tab, we have the parameters we've examined in the previous video. These are exactly the same parameters that can help us to slightly improve how the chat will respond. At the top, we have options such as if we do not like the response given by the chatbot, we can click on the Replay Chat button, which will generate a new response from the bot. We also have the option to clear the chat. There's another option for configuring the Playground settings, and we even have one to view the source code being generated as part of the API request. Various languages are available, including the keyword option, which we could use to obtain code for different programming languages or platforms. Another important point is that here we have an option that says Deploy to. This could be used to deploy this chat configuration to a web application in a straightforward manner. While this falls outside the demo objectives of our course, it's certainly an interesting option that you might want to explore further.